Every reader has a gateway writer, that person whose work opened a door to what's possible or plucked the right string in your heart. For me, that writer was Donald Barthelme. Honestly, you may not have heard of him outside of this podcast. He was a very famous writer in New York literary circles starting in the 1960s. He passed in 1989, just 3 years before I discovered him. In my formative years as a novice writer, I was mildly obsessed with his work. I consumed nearly everything he wrote. I read critical interpretations of his work, interviews with the author, and even source material that he referenced in his stories. This is how I came to mail order a book, pre-Amazon, mind you, on time binding by a man named Alfred Korzybski. Did this help me become a better writer? No. No, it did not. But what I recall most about that time in my journey was straining to view every novel or story Barthelme had written, even the ones I didn't like, as an inevitable journey into artistic genius. Donald Barthelme's work had a disproportionate influence on how I developed as a writer. It wasn't his fault. After all, he had already left us by the time I woke up. What Barthelme did exceptionally well, beyond playing with and in some ways innovating the form of the short story, and beyond cracking jokes in the face of existential dread, which I especially admired, was evoke mood through specific detail. Unlike Faulkner, whose sentences would meander and drift like so many petals in the breeze, playing across the feet of the children in their Sunday best dress shoes as they shifted and shuffled in the pews, all the while their parents berating them in hissing tones to stand still, quiet down, hush up, Susie. Barthelme would pop you in the nose, step back, and smirk at his handiwork. And unlike Hemingway, whose spare prose was lean and always in service of telling a good, fine tale, Barthelme's prose often careened around from the absurd to the banal to the surreal, delighting in its comical sadness. I am no Barthelme expert. I guarantee hundreds or even thousands of others out there are better versed in his body of work, better equipped to uncover the nuance of his greatness. But his impact on me, through his use of specific detail, is undeniable. Barthelme is why I started to write. That is a powerful thing to admit, that a man dead almost 4 years prior was the prime mover in my decision to pursue the discipline of fiction. The irony is that, had I met the man in person, we may not have gotten along. In my more mature view of the world now, having met my heroes in other disciplines and come away shaken, disillusioned, and sullen, I honestly am glad that we missed each other in time. I'm grateful to Barthelme for being masterful at his art, for sharing that with the world, and for the good fortune I had to stumble onto it at the best possible moment. To learn more about the match that lit my fuse as a writer, read Donald Barthelme's story, The Indian Uprising. I have included a link to it in the show notes. It was published in The New Yorker on February 26, 1965. The first paragraph starts off, "We defended the city as best we could. The arrows of the Comanches came in clouds. The war clubs of the Comanches clattered on the soft yellow pavements. There were earthworks along the Boulevard Mark Clark, and the hedges had been laced with sparkling wire. People were trying to understand. I spoke to Sylvia. 'Do you think this is a good life?' The table held apples, books, long-playing records. She looked up. 'No.' It is a short story, just shy of 2,400 words. It contains coded subtext in its symbolism. On the surface, the story pinballs wildly from place to place, with the narrator desperate to repel the invasion and resolve the surreal problems arising within the narrative, while we, the reader, are left to sort out which of them are real and which are quasi-fever dreams of a desperate man in crisis. From this story, I learned the definition of fenestrate, uncovered what aquavit was, and marveled at a literal wall of words aligned vertically in the text. When I finished reading it for the first time, my reaction was, "Oh my God, this was amazing. This was incredible. What the hell did I just read?" It took me years before I felt confident enough to write a critical paper on the Indian Uprising in college, where I begged my professor for special permission to replace the actual assignment with one of my own creation, and he agreed, and I got an A on the paper. I had cracked the code, and it felt satisfying But the thrill of the work was in how he presented the story, how Bartholomew set the table and invited me to dine with him. So when the narrator says, "We defended the city as best we could," it reveals a fatalism that they don't succeed. So if we know they won't succeed from the first sentence in the story, maybe the story is not about whether they succeed or fail. If so, then what is the story really about? All this from the first 8 words. It is a dense story to unpack and well worth the investment. The detail is incredible. Bartholomew grabs us by the chin and pulls our field of vision where he needs it, moment by moment, creating the sense of fear, chaos, desperation, and combat through his use of military terms, naming streets after famous generals, clouds of arrows and war clubs clattering, putting us in the middle of the fight, only for him to rip us away in that same paragraph to apples, books, and long-playing records on the table, which we learn through clever juxtaposition refer to a different kind of combat. As you look to utilize specific detail in your work, follow these simple guidelines. First, linger on important details and focus the reader's attention on the critical, the necessary. Then, offer a value judgment on the detail so the reader knows how to interpret it. Lastly, don't linger on everything, but only on the essential, the most memorable. Specific detail is your best friend in your story. It helps promote what you choose to show the reader as supremely important in the narrative. It helps immerse the reader in your setting, conflict, and action. And it proves your case to the reader as to why your narrative's world is the way it is. Bartholomew's city in the Indian Uprising is not a real city, even though it is described in precise detail. Where he chose to linger shows us his internal logic, revealing the cipher to decode the symbols in the action. Make sure your specific detail isn't just cool, interesting, or evocative of a time and place. Put your specific detail to work in revealing the purpose of your story. Your readers will thank you for it. They may even be inspired to follow in your footsteps. See you next week. Start writing.